Welcome to the Learning Center. My name is Lillian Travaglini, and you're very, very fortunate today because you're having a professor here, emeritus of Cambridge College, who teaches about the brain. His name is Dr. John Grassi, and you are going to be really informed and delighted. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again. I think I was here a few years ago.
Right, but
So
everybody has forgotten, so this is a new show.
Good,
Yeah.
good.
So tell me, I'm going to ask you to start,
Yes,
give me an overview.
okay,
Yeah.
all right.
I have no
Well,
idea what's going to happen.
All right,
I
and
know
then ask
nothing about-
questions
yeah,
as you'd like. Okay,
Yeah,
let's
all right.
let's begin with some things about the human brain itself. The human brain in a fully grown adult weighs about 3 pounds.
Really? Yeah.
It has the consistency of, some people would say, Jell-O or a ripe avocado.
Really?
And so it's very, very soft. And that's one of the problems. The skull and the cranium that cover the brain, as you can see by looking at this
It
model
almost looks
here,
like a cantaloupe.
is, well, it's very hard. And you see all the ridges inside?
Yeah.
Well, when you've got something that is the consistency of Jell-O, and if anything, for example, like a traumatic brain injury, something hits into the head itself, what happens is you've got something very hard coming against something which is very soft, and that's one of the sources of brain damage. When the inside of the skull, you can rub your fingers in there and feel the protuberances.
Oh,
You
yes.
see how sharp they are?
Oh, yeah.
So what protects the brain itself? There's a fluid that's called the cerebrospinal fluid.
Right.
It's like the hydraulic fluid in your car, and it fills up all of the cracks and crevices. And then there are 3 membranes that wrap around the brain. So that is the brain itself. Now, in terms of its composition, it is composed of approximately 86 billion cells, nerve cells, that we call neurons.
How did they ever discover that fact?
I'm glad you asked that question. Now, initially,
Whoever
when they
counted it.
well, initially that's what they had to do. They would take a small slice of brain tissue,
Right.
and they would count the number of neurons that they found in there,
Right.
and then from that they would extrapolate. They would say, well, if this represents so many centimeters of brain tissue, then how much? Multiply it by 1,400 times, and that'll give us the approximate
When was
number
that
of neurons.
first discovered? Is it a recent
Well,
discovery?
we've learned most about the brain, believe it or not, during the last 20 years. And the reason for that is because of the new imaging technologies. So we have CAT scans and we have MRIs and all of that. See, in the past, before I would say 1990 or so, what happened was the people who were looking at the brain, for most people, for most neuroscientists, without these imaging technologies, you had to extrapolate from injuries. So if something happened, let's say, to the frontal lobe of the brain,
Right.
and a person's personality changed as a result of it.
The frontal lobe
then-
is in control of that.
Well, the personality in many things. It's
Yeah.
called the executive lobe of the brain, where all of our decision making takes place. And if something happened to that part of the brain, then they would say, aha, so there's a connection between injury to this part of the brain and then a behavior. Now, for many years, the behaviorists, people like Thorndike and Skinner and folks like that, said, we don't really know what's going on inside of the brain. And they didn't. This was in the 1920s, 30s, 40s.
Yeah.
So they would say, let's look at what goes into the brain and what comes out of the brain. If we don't like what's coming out of the brain, we will shape the input. So
Now,
we had
when you say
input and
coming
output.
in, does that mean vocals, sounds?
Everything,
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
And they would say, okay, so let's use rewards and punishments.
Okay.
So if they don't like what they see coming out, then they're going to reward the learner or they're going to punish the learner.
Right.
And from that, the whole school of behaviorism developed. Now, once you take a look inside of the brain, however, you can see that there's a lot of stuff going on
Right.
in there.
Wow.
So, for example, to go back to your original question, initially they estimated on the basis of counting those cells and extrapolating that there were 100 billion neurons in the brain.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, 100 billion neurons,
in this
right?
part of your
Yeah,
body.
yeah, in a small area of
Well,
the
are
body.
these tiny, or
Oh, well, how the size of them?
Yeah.
Several thousand can fit on a rice grain. That's how small they are,
Oh, my
yet
goodness.
so very, very powerful.
Yeah.
Now, what did this mean? So, a few years ago, they said, let's really go back and let's take a different tact at looking at how do we figure out how many nerve cells the brain has, how many neurons the brain has. So they, 4 brains were donated after the people had died.
Oh, thank
and
God
what
they were dead.
Yes, right. And what they did was they homogenized them.
Right.
They put them in a blender and they
All together?
created a slurry. A slurry is like a liquid, semi-liquid gel mass.
Oh, yeah.
And what they did then is they stained the slurry. And what they were able to find was that the brain had fewer than 100 billion neurons. It only had 86 billion
Oh,
neurons.
only a tiny amount. Yeah,
Exactly,
yeah, yeah.
exactly. So that's how these discoveries come about.
Right.
I mean, they came about as a result of hundreds of scientists working throughout the world in very small parts of the brain, looking at certain things, looking at others, and trying to make a decision
Can I
as
ask
to
a
what
very
was happening.
stupid question at this
There
point?
are no stupid questions.
All right.
Yes.
Is there some way that we, as humans, either by diet or exercise, increase the amount of brain cells?
Well, this, I think, raises an interesting question. I find it interesting because it has to do with optimal brain health.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that the brain needs, and a lot of people know this, is oxygen.
Oh, yeah.
Although it occupies only 1/50th of the total weight of the human body, it consumes a tremendous amount of oxygen, and it consumes about 25% of the glucose that is available for the entire body. Something weighing 3 pounds uses that much energy, glucose, that provides it
How
with
do
the
we
energy.
provide the oxygen to it? Just by the way we breathe?
The breathing. So to go to your question, naturally, the more oxygen that you bring to the brain, the more efficient the brain is going to work. And also, of course, good eating habits. Let me give you an example of one of the things that doesn't work so well for the brain. I'm holding in my hand here a bottle of sugar.
You're right.
And what I have here is the amount of sugar that you see in here is what the average American teenager takes in on a daily basis. 34 teaspoons of sugar.
Right.
Now, this is sucrose,
Yeah.
right? Now, the sugar that the brain makes use of is glucose.
Yeah.
When you take in this much sugar, the body has to expend a tremendous amount of energy by secreting insulin, for example, to nullify or to neutralize the effect of all of the sugar.
I see.
Which means that the energy that's available to expend elsewhere is being spent just on your sugar chemistry.
So we should cut down on the
So
amount
one of the
sugar.
things that we can do, to get back to your question, is that if we can convince our teenagers that, look, in a bottle of Coca-Cola, you have what's the equivalent, a small bottle of Coca-Cola, to 12 cubes of sugar.
Yeah.
Now, if I put those on the table, would you eat that?
No.
No. And I remember once when I was working in Chicago, working with teachers, I was standing outside the classroom doors and the kids were coming by, and I would ask questions, what did you have for breakfast this morning? And they would say, well, I had a liter of Coke. And in my head, I was saying a liter of Coke, that's about 15 or 20 teaspoons of sugar.
Right.
And what else did you have? I had 2 bagels. Figure another 15, 20 teaspoons of
Right,
sugar.
right.
So before the school day began, these kids had probably taken in several teaspoons of sugar that was going to make learning very, very difficult until the sugar level was brought down by the reduction
how
of
does
insulin.
the high sugar affect learning? I mean, the
Well,
brain
what
gets
happens,
numbed?
like any substance in the body, when too much is taken in, the brain has to adjust all of its systems
yeah.
to recreate what we call a homeostatic state. And later we're going to look at what part of the brain does that.
Yeah.
But let me give you a couple of examples of why all of this is very, very important. First of all, the brain is not finished when the child is born.
Right.
A lot of development takes place inside of the womb, but one of the things that happens is those tens of billions of neurons have to begin to hook up with one another.
I see.
And another process takes place, and this process is called myelination. Now, I want to talk about this by holding this on my head, if I may.
Sure.
If you have teenagers at home, what you need to remember is that the brain that you see there is still under construction, particularly the frontal lobes of the brain, where all of the higher reasoning takes place, the decision making and everything else. So for the parents in our audience, I want you to remember that if you see this teenager who has an adult body making bad decisions, please understand it's because the development is still taking place. Now, how long does that development take place? Up until the mid-20s.
Before they
And
make
it's a
logical,
process called myelination.
Right.
And we're going to show you exactly what myelination is. This is
Wonderful.
going to be a first
Yeah.
for the TV station here. So I'm going to use a prop for this.
Good.
Let's look
This
at
is so exciting.
this is a model of a neuron. Now
Yeah.
remember, you have about 86 billion of these and other neurons in the brain.
Right.
10% of the 86 billion neurons are of the nerve cells that you have in the brain are the neurons that you see here.
Right.
The other 90% are support cells.
Yeah.
And you're going to see what those do. Notice the component parts of a neuron. Looks like a tree, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And you can see like these little branches on top here.
Yeah.
These are called dendrites. Dendrites from the Greek word meaning a branching and so forth.
yeah.
Then you're going to see this part here, which has covered with a plastic that represents the cell membrane. That's the cell body.
Membrane. Yeah.
The cell
It's
membrane.
clear like that.
Yep. Inside you can see, if I can get it to work here, the nucleus rolling around,
Right.
like every cell. But the interesting thing about the neuron is it doesn't stop here. So unlike a liver cell, which looks like a little lump of sugar and so forth, it extends itself. And this extension here is called an axon. Now, down at the bottom, we have more branches. These are known as terminal branches. So this neuron has to communicate sometimes with as much as 20,000, 30,000 other neurons. And it can't do it by touching. So it does it electrically and chemically by sending neurotransmitters between here on one neuron and the dendrites on the other neuron. So now what happens? When a child is born, the child's neurons look something like this. And they're very inefficient.
About how big are they in the brain?
In the brain, again, about 10,000 of them can fit on a rice grain.
But
That's
they all
how
look
large
like
they are.
this.
No,
No?
just the neurons that are transmitting the messages. The
Okay,
other
yeah.
support cells look a little bit differently
All
than
right,
this.
yeah.
Okay. They're not very efficient. Now, when your kids were growing up, you probably noticed initially when they were born, they had problems seeing
Right.
because the lobe of the brain that takes light information and then makes sense out of it is the lobe that I'm pointing to right here. It's called the occipital lobe.
Right.
And it has not myelinated yet. It is not fully developed. But within a few months' time, the children are no longer seeing shadows. Now they're seeing faces. And then the other changes begin to take place. As the neurons further up in the brain, in this area here, are taking place, the somatosensory strip of the brain, their sense information begins to improve. They're hearing better.
They recognize familiar faces.
Oh, they recognize faces. And then when the motor strip, that's when their arms and legs, when they finally are able to grab their toes and be able to grasp things and things like that. So let's look at what a myelinated neuron. Could you just hold this one
Sure,
here? And so
yeah.
we can compare the two of them. Now, this is what happens when the neuron myelinates. Everything here is the same. You still have dendrites here.
Yeah.
But notice what I have here as plastic sheaths wrapping the axon of the neuron.
Yeah,
That's called the myelin sheath. And what it does is it makes this neuron here 100 times more efficient in terms of its ability to send messages
Does
to other
everybody
neurons.
get that? Have it?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And as a matter of fact, in some medical conditions like multiple sclerosis,
Yeah.
one of the problems with that condition is that it's like an autoimmune situation where your own cells in your body are going to attack and eat the myelin sheath.
Oh, wow.
And depending upon the area in the brain where the sheath is being broken down, you might have loss of muscular control, you might have visual problems, and so forth. So let's look at the two of these
What causes
together.
that to happen?
Well, we're going to look at
Okay,
this.
all right, yeah.
So let's look at this one here. This one here, which is the unmyelinated, the ones that
yeah.
we're born with,
Right.
before it myelinates, it can transmit messages down the length of its axon This is about a meter in length in about 1 second time. So this one, once it's myelinated,
Want me to hold it?
can be
Yeah.
100 times faster.
Oh, wow.
It can transmit 100 meters per
time-
second.
What year or month does this happen?
This is happening as a continual process in the brain.
As the child matures?
As the child matures,
Right.
more and more myelin is building
The
up.
more myelinating, the better?
The more
The healthier-
efficient.
Yeah,
the more efficient.
Yeah.
That's why I'm saying the frontal lobes are among the last parts of the brain to myelinate, and you don't have the decision making
Yeah.
that you would expect adults to have in a 19-year-old kid.
Yeah.
I mean, witness some of our young stars and the crazy things that they do.
All I can think
It's
of is like the name of the latest one,
Yeah. Well, look, we won't mention their names
No,
here, but you have an
no, we
idea.
won't.
Okay.
No.
So let's look then at how do we myelinate this neuron here. So
Right.
I'm going to ask you to be a special type of cell in the brain.
All right.
And you're going to be what we call, hold this up, oligodendrocyte. Oligodendrocyte.
Don't ask me to learn to spell it.
Well, most of these words come from the Greek.
Oh, yeah.
And oligodendrocytes is a part of what we call the glial cells. Glia in Greek means sticky stuff, glue.
Yeah.
It's the stuff that holds everything together in the brain.
I see.
Now, these oligodendrocytes love your neurons so much that they're going to do something special for it. And we're going to show you what they're going to do for it. So I'm going to take this sheath here, this plastic sheath, and I'm going to wind it around the
I help you?
unmyelinated neurons.
Yeah.
So if you'd like to just hold that there
Yeah,
for a
right.
second.
Yep,
And then I'm going to wind this around like this
right,
and keep on winding
yeah.
and winding
Yeah,
and winding. And now let's leave an end there, and you hold that with your hand.
all right.
You are the oligodendrocyte, and you love this neuron so much that you extend your own cell membrane out to wrap it like you're giving it a hug.
Oh, wow.
Now you can, because neurons don't have only two arms, they could have many extensions.
Oh, really? Yeah.
They can wrap up many of these neurons that we have here. So let's look at, for example, this is a picture here. And what you see here is you can see the cell body. Here's you, and I'm going to put this down for a second
Yeah.
here. This is you right here.
The
You're the
cell.
oligodendrocyte.
Yeah.
Okay. And here's an axon. The yellows are axons here.
Yeah.
And notice, you've extended yourself out to one, to another, and many times any neuron in your vicinity, this is what's wonderful about these glial cells, can be myelinated. Now this process starts usually in the womb at about 16 weeks. And it goes on until the child or the young adult is about 23, 24 years of age. So you've got to be very, very patient with that process. Now, what does that result in? Because that was one of your questions. So let's go back to this. Again, in the neuron that has this myelin sheath around it, like this, that is just beginning to myelinate, you're going to have slower transmissions. So depending upon which part of the brain they're located, your vision will be better or won't be as good until that area is fully myelinated.
Does
Okay?
it sometimes not myelinate? Is there anything that could...
Well, I mean, there are some situations where, as I mentioned to you, the myelin sheath breaks down
Yeah.
or it doesn't myelinate on schedule. That's why with children, you'll see a variation in maturity and how different parts of the brain develop. But now, once they're myelinated, let's go back to our myelinated neuron here. Instead of the impulse that is being received and the information that's being received from other neurons coming in through the dendrites here, and then having to go down the whole length of that axon, guess what? Now what happens is you have these little nodes, the places between the myelin, and these are called nodes of Ranvier. All these things were named after neuroscientists in those days.
They discovered them.
And what happens is that there is a small, this is called an axon hillock here. So let's say 1,000 messages are being received by these dendrites. Now the cell has to decide, are those messages important enough for me to get the neuron to fire?
Yeah.
So to fire or not to fire. So you have to have a mathematician in your neuron. And this is called the axon hillock. It
Just
does the
imagine.
math.
Yeah.
How many inhibitory impulses do I have? How many of those are going to be excitatory impulses? And if there are more excitatory messages coming in than inhibitory, then the neuron will fire. Now what that means is that the membrane surrounding the axon will depolarize. So sodium atoms will rush in to this, and the potassium atoms will rush out. And it's like do-si-do, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Well, now in the myelinated neuron, you don't have to go down the entire length because the depolarization takes place just at the nodes. So it's like it jumps like this, which makes it more efficient. And as a result of that, the kids' brains begin to mature. Let's look for a minute at the parts of the brain and how they begin to mature here. According to the research, the first areas of the brain to mature are the parts that are critical for survival: the brainstem, breathing, the sucking reflex, heartbeat, all of those things that you need.
In the stem?
Yeah,
Is
right,
that
right
like
here.
in the middle of your neck?
No, it's right on the part I'm pointing to right here is the part that is the top of the brainstem. Here's the brainstem that goes right down, attached to the spinal cord, right down to the bottom of your spine. And it's the top of it that sits right up here into the brain. Well, now what happens here is that this myelinates first, then the myelination begins to work towards the surface. We call the surface, this very folded surface that you see here, the cortex. All the higher thinking skills take place there, all of the motor things, the ability to see, the ability to balance, to do all of that. Hanging below the cortex is some scientists refer to it as the little brain. It's the cerebellum. Initially, it had a lot to do with balance. So once you learn how to ride a bicycle, you don't have to relearn that because this part of the brain remembered the code. And you do it automatically, almost reflexively.
Right.
So the myelination goes up and out towards the surface, and then it goes from the back of the brain to the forward part of the brain. So it starts here. Visual lobe starts to myelinate. Parietal lobe starts to myelinate.
What is the
Parietal
parietal?
lobe helps us to remember where we are in space.
Oh, I see.
Some part of the brain has to integrate these tens of thousands of impulses. Am I sitting up? Am I about to keel over?
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the human spinal cord, it has like an S-curve in it.
Yeah.
Because trying to get something to balance on 2 feet is difficult.
Right.
Someone once said it would have been nice if we had a third foot because we'd be like a tripod. But human beings are always falling.
Yeah.
So the brain has to keep it stable. It has to do that. And so the parietal lobe tells you what your position in space is. There's something else that's very interesting about the parietal lobe. At least they found in the case of Einstein, the parietal lobe was very important in learning mathematics.
Obviously, yeah.
So something about relationships between numbers and things like that. Then comes the somatosensory strip. When that myelinates, now the kids are able to take any sensory stimulus that comes in, and they're able to make sense of it. Finally, the motor strip here. Now their motions are more fluid. The children can begin to learn how to walk. They have control of fine motor control, gross motor control. And then finally, around age 22, 23, the last of the lobes to myelinate is the frontal lobe. Yeah. Now here's the problem. The frontal lobe is the executive lobe. If you were to think about a car, then it's the part of the car that would be similar to the brakes.
Yeah.
Until it's myelinated, teenagers don't have brakes. They have a lot of gas, right?
Yeah.
They can get the car to move fast, but they don't have brakes. So that's why we say to parents, remember this. Those frontal lobes are still under construction.
Right.
And they're going to be under construction until the mid-20s. You wonder, how do they get through college? You know, how do they make it through high school? Well, there are problems. Someone once said maybe they should start college when they're 24 and most of the myelination has taken place. Yeah. But it's an interesting point. And then at that point, when the frontal lobe finally starts to myelinate, the kids can make decisions. So what does a parent do in the meantime? Until about age 23, 24, you are the child's frontal lobes.
You make the decisions.
So if the kid says, I want to buy a car, you've got to sit down and say, now wait a minute. Let's take a sheet of paper and let's look at all the pros and cons. No, Mom, I want to buy the car, because they're acting out of the emotional parts of the brain, right?
Yeah.
So being a parent, while that myelination is still ongoing, is saying no more than saying yes. And they can't help it because they don't have the wherewithal here in the frontal lobes to
It's
make
not
those
their
types
fault.
of decisions.
I know.
Now, one interesting thing here was that in the 1850s, during the period of the Civil War, there was a very famous neurological event that took place up in the state of Vermont, Maine, this area of the country.
One of those
where
days.
a man who was working on the railroad, very responsible person, had an accident. He was tamping a rod to put they had to blow apart the, what do we call it, the rocks, and he was tamping a rod in, and the rod scraped against the stone, caused a spark, and the rod went right up through his frontal lobes. And he survived for a number of years. As a matter of fact, both his skull and brain are on display at the Harvard Medical School. The only
Really?
problem was, the big thing was, his entire personality changed
I see.
because they destroyed the part of the prefrontal lobes that really are responsible for making a person very responsible and all of that.
Right.
His language changed. He could no longer keep the job, and he went around in a
Acting
sideshow.
like a teenager.
Yeah, like the usual teenager, walked around in a sideshow carrying the rod to say, see what happened to me.
Yeah.
So that's how we learned about these things. We learned about them as a result of injuries that took place in the brain at that time.
Well,
Yes.
John, this is so awesome.
Uh-huh.
You have to come back and do another show, can you?
Yes, and what we'll look at next time is we'll go deep into the interior of the brain, and that's where the fun stuff starts.
Oh, really?
And where all of the things that we take for granted take place in that part of the brain.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm so filled with awe, and
Yeah,
it's like opening a whole new world. And
yes.
I'd like to know, can we control any of these things, or that we can't?
Up at a certain age, you can't.
Yeah.
At other ages, as you become adults and the frontal lobes begin to myelinate, then you can control a lot of things. And it's a good thing we have those frontal lobes, because if not, we would be just like teenagers.
Right.
We would act on a whim.
Yeah.
We would be very aggressive. We would do things that obviously make no sense, and so
Because
forth.
there's a whole body of people that say, if we meditate,
Yes.
we can, our subconscious mind can take over, and we can control everything in our life. So I don't know
Yes.
if you want to touch
Well,
upon that.
I mean, first of all, you have to be careful when you use the word mind with neuroscientists.
Right.
Because if you talk about the body and mind, then you're a dualist.
Right.
That came about as the work of French philosopher René Descartes. He said there's the brain, the body, and then there's the mind.
Well-
Neuroscientists like to look at the
Yeah.
thing being a continuum. It's brain-mind. The
Now-
mind is what the brain does.
Yeah, and my viewers, are you all fascinated as I am, and awesome? So I can't use the word. I mean, you're opening a whole new world that I find fascinating.
Well, thank
so tune in. We're going to have a second part to this show. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.